Yeah. So anyway, honeybees, 5G, colony collapse, and quantum bio.
Right. Well, hopefully this will be, so I guess for people watching the video, I'm Geoff. I'm a co-founder of the Quantum Biology DAO. And so oh, hey, Michelle. Good to see you here. So yeah, how should we do this? Should we just keep going with what we were talking about, or
I
should
think I
we?
think you had the right instinct there. Why don't we? I'll introduce this, and then you can introduce
Great.
yourself. So yeah,
Perfect.
welcome to the PsyDAO Science Working Group. Today we have Geoff Anders from Quantum Bio here to speak to us about quantum biology and for us to probe his domain of knowledge on ways that psychedelics are potentially affect or be affected by quantum biology processes. So I'll let Geoff, you can introduce yourself, and then we can just jump right into some of the questions we have.
Yeah, sounds great. So, hi everybody. For people who haven't encountered quantum biology, basically it's the field at the intersection of quantum physics and biology. It's the field's been around for a while, but it's still pretty small. It's growing, but the big reason people haven't looked here is that quantum theory is sort of a big mess, and learning it, you have to learn a whole bunch of math. A whole bunch of people went into biology because they loved science, but they didn't want to deal with as much math. And then it's just very difficult to get the biologists and the physicists. There's the molecular biologists need to get involved. You need cell biologists, and there are a lot of people who you have to bring together if you're going to actually talk about the thing that we study, which is quantum effects in biology. So this is sort of what our DAO is for. We got the DAO started in November of last year. We then did a token auction in December. That went well. We launched our token, set up the DAO, and basically our goal is to advance the field of quantum biology. Doing so, this includes grants to fundamental research, grants to people looking at things that are of public interest that won't get covered by other things. One question we get a lot is 5G killing me, and what do you know about that? But then there's all this connective tissue needed for a field to exist. You need journals, it's actually the instruments. Let's say you want to study the effect of weak magnetic fields in biology. Why weak magnetic fields? We could ask that question. That's a great rabbit hole to go down, but it's one of the things that's focused on because the effects are essentially explained in a quantum way. But if you want to study this, if you just want to put a magnetic field on a bunch of cells, it's not a simple thing to apply a uniform magnetic field. You have to arrange the magnets in the right way, and all of a sudden you're way outside the biologist's sort of regular domain of expertise. So anyway, so producing instruments, getting a journal is the most recent thing we started talking about, grants, and then communication like this, where we get to tell people about quantum biology and how it relates to sort of everything.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's interesting. I think that you're probably one of the only DAOs that's really just starting to start an entire field, not just a DAO about a field.
Yeah, it's there. So there is some other work in quantum biology. There's a foundation, the Guy Foundation, which is specifically focused on quantum biology. Jeffrey Guy, the founder, just came out with a book entitled Quantum Biology. And the field has actually been around for multiple decades. But with that said, this is the DAO is now the largest funder of quantum biology. We're the sort of like center of attention for a lot of what's happening in the field, and we think there's this great opportunity to essentially build the whole field from the ground up.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get into the heady stuff, which I'm sure we'll get there eventually, I have a biology background, and I'd love to understand what processes are we aware of that are affected by something that can be considered in the quantum biology realm.
Sure.
Or what, and if there's nothing that we have hard evidence for that it is being affected, what's the first foray? What's the most highly speculated on?
Yeah, so great question. So there has been evidence of quantum effects in biology for a really long time. And then, of course, people familiar with quantum physics, it's the science that covers what happens when things are very, very small. You might think, well, of course, biology depends on quantum, because like everything depends on quantum, because quantum covers the small stuff and the big stuff depends on the small stuff. So when we talk about quantum biology, we're talking not just about the big stuff depending on the small stuff. We're talking about the cases where, in order to really understand what's happening at the macro level, you have to dig in and understand what's happening at the quantum level. That's not always true, but it is true in some cases. The most famous example, I think, is actually photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is a more efficient process than we would know how to explain classically, but you bring in some quantum concepts, in particular noise-assisted tunneling, and that lets you explain why is photosynthesis so efficient. Now, I'm going to occasionally say quantum words, and when I do, it's just totally fine to ask relevant questions and stuff. So, but anyway, that's one that is well known. The one that we're especially excited about actually is the effect of weak magnetic fields. So normally, when you think about classical effects, if something affects something when it's weak, then if you make it stronger, it's going to make the effect stronger. So if things are affected by weak magnetic fields, you might expect that there is going to be a stronger effect as you make the magnetic field stronger. Except it turns out that's not the case, and that there is a quantum mechanism underlying there being essentially a sweet spot for weak magnetic fields. This is something that people generally don't think about. They haven't studied quantum. Like, so NASA, for example, is starting to pay attention to this, but most of the people there, they took quantum physics, when they were in college, but then mostly they're thinking about things like things that work classically. So like with radiation in space, as you get more of it, you get a larger effect. This is not true for weak magnetic fields, at least the ones that work on electron spin superpositions, the relevant underlying quantum mechanism. So then there's this entire essentially domain that hasn't really been explored that much. So people find weak magnetic fields affecting many different cell types, many different organism types, and then the best way to explain this is a quantum mechanism. I'll just give a quick example. So the Quantum Biology DAO has been funding the Quantum Biology Institute. There's a lot of overlap in terms of the founding of these things. The Quantum Biology Institute is the nonprofit that's doing the foundational research. So the first experiment there was we built a hypomagnetic chamber. So this is a big metal box that has mu metal, which is a nickel alloy, and then it has copper shielding, and this blocks DC and AC magnetic fields. We then used active compensation, which is basically a bunch of coils that you run electricity through, and that helps to produce a counteracting magnetic effect. And we got the strength of the magnetic field inside the chamber down to less than 1 nanotesla. For reference, the Earth's magnetic field is like 45,000 nanoteslas. So this is much, much weaker. And then we raised tadpoles inside and outside the chamber. Controlled conditions, temperature, lighting, and humidity, and found that tadpoles raised inside the chamber developed more quickly. We worked with another researcher and did a similar study on killifish, which is this fish that has this cool feature that it goes into this weird hibernation state called diapause, where it basically, you can dry them out. It's sort of like tardigrades that can exist in space for, and you're like, how do those things last? Killifish are at least somewhat like that. But we found that ones raised inside the chamber got stuck in diapause for way longer. And so that meant that their development was much slower. So we're seeing faster development and we're seeing slower development. And the only thing we're doing is blocking out the Earth's magnetic field, which is a very weak field. It's weaker than the strength of the field from your cell phone.
Yeah, that's pretty insane. So
Yeah.
development occurs faster in a situation that is far removed from the evolutionary the conditions under which animals evolve to develop. That's really counterintuitive.
Well, except the killifish developed slower, and
Okay, yeah,
so
right.
and then we're doing a similar study, a less cool hypomagnetic chamber, but still a hypomagnetic chamber with our Maryland lab, where we are doing E. coli, and well, we should wait a little bit before we say, but it looks like the growth curve for E. coli is different. So what we can say is that the rate of development is being changed just by the presence or absence of the Earth's magnetic field.
Wow. Yeah,
And
that's
then,
super fascinating.
yeah, and then just to add, and so then, but this is not the sort of thing that scales up. So if you bring in your heavy magnets and so forth, like your MRI, this is not, we think, the same effect. And so this is not just something that there are bacteria that have little chunks of magnetite, where if you scale it up, then like that there'll be a larger effect. But here, the relevant quantum mechanism has a sweet spot.
Wow. Wow, that's very cool. And so development, what is your first instinct on the mechanism by which the magnetic field is going to be impacting development? Is this like genes are like the genetic programs are, yeah, you'd think that the genetic programs would be different, like maybe different genes would be expressed, but if everything's happening normally, but the rate is the difference, that's the thing that's really wild to me.
Yeah, so we're doing a transcriptomic study right now on E. coli. Hopefully Mike is in the lab today. Hopefully we'll have results next week. It may take another week. But we're going to see how gene expression gets affected. So we're looking at it from this top-down way. But then the question of what's actually happening at the more basic level, this is what our main lab in Los Angeles is doing. We're building a special microscope that lets you catch the quantum signature of long-lived quantum states inside cells at room temperature. And then there's a question, and I myself am thinking about and very focused on this question of what is the actual underlying mechanism. A whole bunch of different mechanisms are posited. There's this thing called the radical pair mechanism, which essentially involves entangled electrons. And the way the entanglement works, you get different numbers of electrons available for chemical reactions. And so that ends up modulating chemical reactions. There's a different mechanism whereby magnetic fields affect essentially the rate of nuclear spin, which makes it so that it's easier or harder for reactions to occur. So you could just imagine that it's as simple as the pace of reactions are changing as you're in different magnetic conditions. But we don't know, and we want to find out. There's been a lot of theory in the area. There's been a bunch of calculation and so forth, but nobody's ever actually built a microscope that lets you look and capture the relevant mechanism. And so that's what we're doing.
Yeah, very interesting. My I have an animal behavior background, and so my wheels are spinning on different animals that you potentially want to raise in a weak magnetic field chamber. And the first one that comes to mind are animals that actually do use the Earth's electromagnetic spin as part of their innate ability to navigate around the world. Like you have butterflies, monarch butterflies too, where navigational information is passed down from generation to generation. During the trips, you have birds that obviously use electromagnetic waves of the Earth to navigate, and that's also that seems to me as like the first way to probe the effect of a quantum states on a cognitive process. And so I wonder, I'm sure, you have this whole roadmap of animals you want to raise there, but I wonder where on the roadmap are animals where you're actually getting into cognitive processes and development and persistence of that in time.
So we don't, the short answer is we don't know. It's actually, so raising birds inside a hypomagnetic chamber is not an not an easy task. We have thought about, my intuition is that we want to start simple and sort of go up step by step. We've had some discussion about whether C. elegans would be worth doing, because there you get behavioral changes. There's like cognition. The challenge with behavior, it's like there are a lot of things we don't really understand. Cognition's one of them.
Yeah.
And so figuring out if we don't understand cognition, we don't understand quantum, there's a strong tendency to, put them together and be like, are these the same? But in like when you're actually studying the things, you want to tease them apart as much as you can, so that you're dealing with something manageable in terms of the amount of unknown.
Yeah, of course. I mean, cognition, of course, is still very much a black box, but there are plenty of quantitative aspects of cognition that one could potentially probe that are ingrained in the literature that relate to cognition, and we know it's related to cognition, that I could see happening. So quantum states in neurons, though, do you have speculation on the effect that quantum states could have on the electrochemical processes of neurons, which is fairly unique among cells?
So yes, they're actually, so right now we have one particular microscope that we're planning to build. It's called a TIRF. It's a total internal reflection fluorescence microscope. And then for people with background, it's also going to have ODMR, so optically detected magnetic resonance, along with nanosecond synchronization and a single photon detector. So that's just for people who are interested in the details. But this actually is just one of the microscopes that the Institute has planned with respect to. There are actually 5 different microscopes that have been conceived, and one of them is specifically for looking at neurons. Now here, lots of people, when they're thinking about cognition, think about it as though it's essentially you're dealing with it's a wiring diagram. You imagine that the neurons are points, the points are all wired together, and the way that they're wired together gives you cognition. A lot of actually artificial intelligence efforts are sort of based on the hope that that's pretty much all that's going on. And and then there's a question. There's some people speculate that actually quantum processes get directly involved in cognition in some way. I can say something a little bit more modest, which is that we've had discussion about whether there's been a number of different lines of discussion, but the simplest one is whether there's any sort of important information that's contained in the electrical potentials around the neurons. And so you might actually have just a little bit lower than the neuron level. There might be another level where there's more information. This actually is one place where you wonder, the brain is very powerful, but the total amount of energy being used in it is relatively low compared to, for example, the amount that's powering the superclusters for current AI systems. Well, okay, so this means that biology is doing something more efficiently. And where have we heard that? Well, so it's got this special efficiency bonus in photosynthesis. Is there some way that there's some sort of efficiency bonus that's coming about as a result of using quantum processes? Let's say, sounds pretty reasonable to me, but I'm not going to say that we know that that's true.
Yeah, I love it. I'm gonna stop hogging the questions and let other people jump in if they have any questions. Feel free, anyone, to jump in. Can get headier with it. We can get more specific with it, but I just want to say that it's amazing once you understand a level of hierarchy in biology that underlies many other things. It just opens up so many questions. We've seen this, like understanding genes and its effect on something that extrapolated as far as like social behavior, which in human social behavior, which was a huge controversy in the 70s and 80s. But like and when you jump these hierarchical levels in biology, there's just so many things to understand in between. So yeah, with that, I'd love to open it up. I see we have a question from Arun. Feel free to jump in.
Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you. Very
Hi, Arun.
interesting talk. Hello. Very nice talk. So I don't know if you are aware of research from Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff.
Yeah, the
Um,
Orco-R theory. Yeah.
yeah, so they proposed that there could be a quantum domain in microtubule that is causing this loss of consciousness. And recently, I think it was last year, in December, I believe, there is a new paper showing that there is a quantum effect in microtubule after all, when they found that there's super fluorescence. So usually fluorescence lifetime is very like in nanoseconds, but this was much longer. They found out when they excite it with some particular wavelength. And then regarding also the neuronal activity. So I have a collaborator from Japan. So we made a proposal to use quantum computers for simulating protein dynamics. So he studied neuronal firing, not only the membrane firing, but the subcellular protein structures like microtubules, actin, neurofilaments. And he found that there are like different frequency firing. So there's a particular frequency, a net frequency of these protein structures, which is 250 microseconds before the neuronal membrane firing happens. And then he was able to stop the firing or start the firing by applying a external magnetic frequency. Yeah, so just wanted to share this. And also you mentioned about tadpoles growing inside this chamber. If you have come across the work of Michael Levin from Tufts University, he has used his bioelectric field, manipulated bioelectric field, and grown multiple heads on a planaria, and also regenerated the limb of adult frog. So I'm wondering if you can create or test this planaria experiment in your chamber, what happens? Yeah, that would be very cool to know.
Yeah, so I would love to. We are so at the Institute, they're currently deciding essentially on strategy. So I would say I don't know yet what the next organism we're going to look at is in our microbiology lab. We're planning to go through and look at we got E. coli, and then yeast, and then H. volcani, and then I think C. bacillus. Basically looking at microorganisms from different parts of the evolutionary history or sort of the evolutionary tree to show that these effects are likely to be happening everywhere. But in terms of what we're going to use the hypomagnetic chamber at the LA lab for yet, not sure. That's a great question. I'd love to. I really like C. elegans as a way forward. So, but let's see. So you mentioned a whole bunch of things. I'm going to just sort of respond to a few things. So one, a lot of so microtubules are really interesting. There's evidence of them responding magnetically, and then so microtubules, for people who maybe haven't encountered this, essentially there's this protein called tubulin, and the tubulin proteins basically end up forming this sort of long tube. It's like a spiral that is connected on one side. There's it's an electric dipole, so there's an electric charge involved. But then when the tubulin form these long tubes, they end up doing things like being the cytoskeleton or infrastructure for the cell. So these show up in all cells, and then they have been proposed to be, so I saw a talk with Hameroff where he was proposing that these are used for the transmission of information. He talked about cellular automata there, which is an interesting topic. But then these are proposed by Penrose and Hameroff to be importantly involved in have a relation to consciousness. So then I want to say with regard to consciousness, so I'm super interested in microtubules. Consciousness is quite hard to get to because it's so poorly understood. You can there's a history where topics that are covered in philosophy eventually come to be covered in science. This is actually even just true. There used to be natural philosophy, and then as sort of social institutions and knowledge evolved, you end up with the things being covered scientifically. There are a bunch of people who study consciousness scientifically, or at least they're trying. The big challenge is figuring out exactly how these theories help to guide research. So if you can have theories that are untested for long periods of time. There's a part of Newtonian physics that wasn't testable for like 100 years after Newtonian physics came out, but the theories can still be useful if they guide research well. So then we get to the superradiance question. So here, I've been talking with a number of researchers. There's a bunch of different opinions on what's happening there. So I want to sort of withhold comment until I'd say we understand the thing better. There is a thing that is sort of amazing, though, which is this possibility that quantum states are lasting for longer than people expect. So if you, the main scientific argument that has been given against quantum biology is that the states don't last long enough to be biologically relevant. And then it's just true that in the quantum computing, you have people sitting there wrestling with how do you have the states stay coherent, right, which means the superposition's still there. And then they're studying, it's easier as they get down to absolute zero in terms of temperature. The systems are really isolated. So the idea that a room temperature system that is open and so it's connected to its environment, the idea that that would somehow allow you to preserve long-lived superpositions just seems hard to believe. Except that I would propose there's sort of a different way of thinking about it, which is that even though we stumbled onto quantum mechanical effects by studying things and then we were able to probe them in these very controlled conditions, evolution is taking advantage of literally anything that it can. So if there's some way for it to take advantage of the laws of quantum physics, then it absolutely is going to. And then do we know how it's going to do that? No, we're coming in from the outside. It's like we found an alien computer and we were like poking at it and we managed to get one part working when it's separated. But like the ability, I guess I would propose that if there's evidence of quantum effects inside cells, so the fact of weak magnetic effects, I think there's really good evidence there. That means nature has somehow likely done it. And if it did it, then maybe if we can study nature, then that's going to teach us how is nature able to preserve the long-lasting superpositions. And then maybe we could use that to be able to advance things like quantum computing.
Thank you.
Yeah, super good. Thanks for your question, Arun. We have a question in the chat. I'll read it out loud. So most of the experiments you describe seem designed to detect quantum effects indirectly in complex biological systems. As a chemist, I tend to think mechanistically, biological effects being driven by chemical effects. So I'm curious if you have any experiments planned that look at whether quantum effects can direct outcomes of chemical reactions in simpler systems, for example, the product rate of enzymatic reactions. And that's from Greg.
Okay, yeah, so the answer is yes. There's actually there's an entire field in chemistry called spin chemistry, which studies a particular type of quantum effect happening inside chemical systems. So this is a thing that is studied. The thing that we're planning to do is, so I mentioned, so we have our magnetic studies that we've done with tadpoles, killifish, and E. coli now. The main focus of the research, though, is going to be with this microscope that I've described. And the plan there is to build up to detecting things directly inside cells at room temperature. To get there, we have to go through a series of steps. So what we're going to do first, and so this is the Institute's work, the Institute is going to, so we now have a molecular biologist who is starting in a couple days, and his primary task is going to be identifying which are the best targets, like basically which are the proteins that we expect to be involved in the magnetosensing. The optics guy, magnetics guy, and Clarice Yellow, the original founder, are going to be constructing the microscope. The microscope is going to fire a laser, bounce it off a bunch of mirrors, and then have it hit a cell, or it's going to hit the target. The target then fluoresces, and we'll have nanosecond resolution in a single photon detector to get the fluorescence pattern. The fluorescence pattern is supposed to contain, if all of this is right, it should contain a particular little oscillation called a Brabby oscillation, but basically it'll just look like a little squiggle. But we're going to do that, and then measuring the length of that is going to give us how long the superpositions are lasting in the relevant target. We're going to start with proteins outside cells at room temperature, and then we're going to look at proteins inside a protected environment inside cells at room temperature, and then just proteins inside cells at room temperature. So we're going to be building up to that. And so as we do that, we're going to end up looking at sort of easier cases where we're going to have a better chance of seeing the mechanism.
Amazing. Okay, we have another question in the chat if no one else wants to ask one. Brittany asks, what's your favorite psychedelic and why? Which has had the most impact on your work?
So it's a great question. I'm here at PsyDAO. We got to talk about psychedelics.
Yeah, we got to get back to psychedelics.
Yeah, no, we got to, of course, we got to. I mean, and there actually are, I suspect, relations between. There are at least going to be potential relations, let's say it that way, between quantum biology and the effects of psychedelics. And so that'd be a fun thing to talk about. In terms of my favorite psychedelic, so I have limited non-zero experience with psychedelics, and I never really thought about which one was my favorite. They all seemed like they seemed so different in terms of cognitive effect. So that's a real. I'd have to think about that question. I don't have an immediate answer.
Well, you have test subjects ever you're recruiting. Right. Low magnetic chamber.
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting because we're doing these studies with the hypomagnetic chamber. The reason the scientific reason to remove the Earth's magnetic field is it's similar to looking at something in vacuum. You're simplifying the circumstance. But magnetic effects don't only get caused by the removal of by looking at the removal, you can see that it's likely that nature was using the Earth's magnetic field as part of evolution. Okay, well, but then what if we apply weak magnetic fields of different strengths? And there's different strengths and directions and frequencies and patterns of application. There actually are a bunch of there's a bunch of evidence that people derive beneficial effects from the application of weak magnetic fields. We have barely started looking into this. Is the sort of there are over-the-counter devices that you can get where you just apply a weak magnetic field. Largely, scientists are like, well, there's no way that could work because there's no mechanism. But are they thinking about the quantum mechanism? Like, not I don't think so. But people report all sorts of effects. We're looking forward to, at some point, spinning up an experimental community. This is sort of like HairDAO. People here, I'm sure, know HairDAO. You got people there experimenting on different things to try to regrow hair. There's what one person was talking about, weak magnetic fields helping with hair growth, so maybe we'll end up in that situation. But with regard to psychedelics, I could see doing studies where you apply weak magnetic fields while, like, to your brain through outside your skull. So that's a cool thing about magnetic fields, is this is non-invasive. So electrical fields get blocked by a bunch of things that magnetic fields don't. So you can actually apply a magnetic field and have it impact what's going on inside your body. So I hadn't thought about this before, but it seems like you should be able to use a weak magnetic field device, apply it to your head, for example, and then and take different psychedelics and see what the effects are. So I haven't thought about, like, what's the correct study design and so forth, but for people just messing with it, the thing I would suggest is be safe, and that the thing to look for are large effect sizes and then large controllable effect sizes. If you find that intervention X with the weak magnetic field produces some surprising difference than without the weak magnetic field, then you can start playing around with that and figuring out, like, what essentially you're working to gain more fine-grained control over the effect using, in this case, the weak magnetic field.
Wow.
I should say that I am a huge fan of self-experimentation, but everybody should understand. So that's not lip service. I am just like 100%. I think it's like a human right in a bunch of ways, but it's very important to do self-experimentation responsibly. And because you guys are interested in psychedelics, I'm sure you've got way more documentation on safe and responsible use and so forth than I'm thinking. But I think that there's a research line here that is very interesting.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, we are all about harm reduction with psychedelics, so we can add a quantum biology harm reduction to our docket.
Well, so actually, there is an interesting thing there, which is that, so we've got this evidence of different organisms responding to the Earth's magnetic field, and that it seems plausible that they took advantage of it in some way as part of the process of evolution. Okay, but then recently, on a time frame that is much shorter than evolution will have had a chance to adapt to, we've changed our electromagnetic environment really quite substantially. So now we are surrounded by electromagnetic fields, and it is often said, well, they're too weak to have any sort of effect. But you see weird effects, like Tyler, you were mentioning the collapse of bee colonies. There's also, like, I wonder about effects on fertility for both men and women. That's a really interesting one. It doesn't seem that there are acute negative effects from the different electromagnetic environment that we live in now, but looking at chronic effects is completely reasonable. So then I would suggest that, I mean, this is another factor in the experiment. You could apply a magnetic field, but you could also do this out in an environment where you are not interacting, you're out in the wilderness and not interacting with a lot of electromagnetic fields around. You have to figure out, one tricky thing is figuring out, if you've got your phone and you're recording data, like, your phone is, giving off, some amount of electromagnetic radiation. So you have to figure out how to manage that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Isabel.
Yeah, so I'm a cell biologist, and thank you for the inspiring insights. So I'm thinking, well, at the moment I work with cancer spheroids, and I do a lot of microscopy to them, so I have them floating in a liquid. So
Yes.
yeah, I was wondering, how feasible it would be to actually do some experimentation on this system to also, assess maybe the effects of the weak magnetic fields to cancer. That goes connected with what you were saying just now. That yeah, how these fields are affecting the tissues, the adult tissues, or cancerogenic tissues. That's one thing. And then I had another idea. Maybe I can say just both together.
Sure.
And yeah, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I have been wondering for many years that how would be actually the effect of the neuron firing to producing magnetic fields themselves. So the neurons themselves producing that, and then connecting it a bit with the psychedelics. Then if psychedelic effects, some of the cases do a lot of firing in the different regions of the brain. If that is actually increasing the magnetic field environment of the brain during psychedelic use, and that could maybe affect neuroplasticity, which is something that's being, for example, studied at the moment. So yeah. Thanks.
Okay, great thoughts. So on the doing weak magnetic field studies on cancer cells, so you might think that because it's cancer, people will have tried literally everything, but as far as I've encountered thus far, there's still a lot of really useful research to be done in this area. The DAO is now producing magnetic rings that create a uniform magnetic field that gets applied to a sample that's in the middle, and we're going to make ones that fit essentially different petri dish sizes. So if this is something you're interested in, like absolutely just DM me or join our Discord, just reach out in some way, because we want to equip researchers like you with the ability to do these experiments. So that's awesome. Please reach out. That's for anyone interested in actually helping with the research. This is something that's crazy, is that there are fairly simple experiments that can be done, that it's because the field's been so neglected, people just haven't looked into. So that's one thing. And then on the question, so with neurons, when you have neurons fire, there's electricity, and then moving electrons produce a magnetic field. There's a question here about whether it's possible to get a feedback loop. So Arun earlier mentioned Mike Levin's work with bioelectricity. My actual guess is that, I mean, when we think about biology, we really don't understand it that well right now. It's not just consciousness, it's not just cognition. There's just tons happening that we don't understand. So my expectation is that the quantum mechanisms are going to be part of it. Bioelectricity is super interesting to look into. One possibility is that there is an electrical to magnetic to quantum feedback loop that then ends up being, for instance, the way that cells manage homeostasis. And so I think that's really interesting and plausible. I would say with regard to affecting neuron function and that affecting plasticity, I wouldn't be surprised there's going to be a link between homeostasis and plasticity, because insofar as things lose the ability to regulate themselves and they lose the ability to change in various ways, the one thing I would mention is that it's not necessarily about increasing. People always have this intuition that it's increasing because of like the experience with refrigerator magnets, or it's like the more, you think the more magnetism, the more of an effect. It's just that if you get a different pattern of neurons firing, you're going to have a different electrical pattern, and so a different magnetic pattern. And that pattern may do something beneficial. If people have actually reported, if you have the use of psychedelics produce different patterns of neuron firing, which I'm sure has been observed and sounds totally obvious, we know that will produce a different set of magnetic fields, weak magnetic fields inside the brain. And then as for how the loop gets completed, I don't know, but it sounds really plausible. So I think worth looking into.
Amazing. Arun, I think you have a question. We can do one last question and then we can wrap up on the hour.
Yeah, so thanks to Isabel for asking that interesting question. I was thinking the same, like what can we do with the cells? So I'm also working with like skin cells, cancer cells, and the protein I'm studying is vimentin. So we have these knockout cells, the cells which doesn't have that vimentin gene, and we have found that the cells grow slower when the vimentin is not there, and also migrate without direction. So I was wondering to see if we manipulate this magnetic field, increase or decrease, can we rescue this phenomena in the knockout cells? And then another question is about the theory, or what do you propose? Like when this magnetic field uh, causes these effects on these
Yeah.
biological systems, what do you think is really happening there? Like what exactly is being affected? Like
Yeah.
is there some magnetic particles in the protein, or something else in some other biomolecule, or is it something to do with the water? Like you see this golden ratio in all
Yeah.
the nature, and you see these amazing patterns. So
Yeah.
I feel like all these biological systems are kind of responding to this invisible field, a quantum field maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, what do you
Okay.
think?
Interesting. So, so on the first point, just like if there's a specific experiment that you want to run, like absolutely reach out to us and we should talk about it more, because helping people do this research is just one of the points of the DAO. So we're absolutely super happy to hear that. On the question of what's actually happening, this is an area where I think there's a lot of uncertainty. One thing that's there's a question of, does it have to do with especially magnetosensitive proteins? The one thing that's worth noting is that all of at least the protons and the electrons are all actually responding to they produce magnetic fields, they respond to magnetism, and then and you're like, well, how does this end up being quantum mechanical? There's this property called spin, which people don't end up studying in classical physics. Essentially, it's one of the ones studied in quantum physics. And it turns out that magnetism of the type that is exhibited by refrigerator magnets like ferromagnetism actually ends up being a sort of emergent macro property that comes about as a result of spin. And then understanding how one thing that a magnetic field does is it causes the spins of particles to become correlated. They go into this state called a superposition. The whole thing's fascinating. Anyway, it's a lot to dig into here. But I suspect that it's going to be important to understand how the magnetic fields are affecting the spins of the particles, how that produces superpositions, how long those last, and what sorts of things that ends up affecting in turn. And I'd say that is exactly the question.
Sorry, I have a quick question. So how would the spins could be measured in living systems?
So measuring, well, so this is part of what the microscope is meant to do. So let me think about how you would measure. You're not going to be measuring the spin of just a single particle. The current plan from the Institute is that we're there. So digging in just a little bit, there is a mechanism called the radical pair mechanism, where essentially when you hit electrons with light, it causes the electrons to gain more energy. They become excited. They then decay in a pattern that has been described, but some of them decay back down and release the light, so you just get a fluorescence pattern. And then some of them go into this superposition state where it's actually an entangled state with two particles. It's a singlet state and triplet state. I'm sorry, I'm saying a bunch of technical stuff, but then basically what ends up happening is that this ends up producing a different number of free electrons for chemical reactions. So on one hand, you get a different rate of chemical reactions, but on the other hand, you end up with a corresponding fluorescence pattern. And so it's possible to measure the fluorescence pattern. And by measuring the fluorescence pattern, that's going to tell you how much of this particular mechanism is happening. And then that's not a direct measurement of the spin of a particular particle, but what it'll do is it's measuring the length of a state called an electron spin superposition.
I think this discussion can go on for so long, and I feel like we only slightly breached psychedelics. Maybe we'll have to have you on in another month or so.
I'd be happy to. This was fun. Yeah, there's so much we didn't get to all sorts of fun stuff.
Yeah. We have to have one just dedicated to telepathy and consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Electrical wires are destroying honeybee colonies and all the good stuff.
Yeah.
Geoff, thank you so much for joining. Super interesting. It was an amazing first kickoff to our sort of science working group series here, and so really appreciate it. Let's keep in touch for sure about potential collaboration aspects. We also have an entire network of psychedelic researchers who study psychedelics, anything from everywhere from petri dishes to humans, and so there'll be some amazing collaboration.
Yeah. Sounds
etc.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, cool. And I'll share all this recording and everything with you as well in case you want to chop it up for your own social. But yeah,
all right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody. Great meeting you all. All right, see you later.
Thank
Bye.
you.